The desert sun scorched the horizon, burning down on exhausted Italian soldiers who could no longer pretend they had a fight left in them. Dust swirled with every uneven step, rifles dragged along the sand, and the silence between men was louder than artillery. Private Marco Bianchi felt the weight of surrender crushing his chest more heavily than the heat pressing on his shoulders. He had grown up in Naples, surrounded by narrow alleys where laughter of children mixed with the cries of fishmongers, but now he was thousands of miles away, watching the end of his unit with hollow eyes. Rumors had spread for weeks. Americans tortured their captives, starved them, forced them into back-breaking work. Others whispered that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that Mussolini would never forgive traitors. Marco knew none of it mattered anymore. They were surrounded, the British pushing from one side, the Americans from the other. His officer dropped his weapon first, hands raised toward the blazing sky, and the rest followed like shadows. "Marco," whispered Carlo, his closest friend in the regiment, voice trembling, "do you think they'll kill us, right here in the sand?" Marco's throat was dry, but he forced the words. "I don't know. I just know it's over." The American soldiers approached with rifles steady but not frantic. Marco braced for shouting, blows, or worse. Instead, an order rang out in English, sharp but not cruel. One of them gestured for the Italians to gather, motioning with his arm more like a conductor than an executioner. The prisoners obeyed, exchanging nervous glances. Marco caught the smell of tobacco drifting from one soldier's pocket and realized with disorienting clarity that these were men too, sweating, blinking, adjusting helmets. He tried not to think about home. The memory of his mother, bent over a pot of simmering sauce, felt like a wound that would not close. He feared he would never see her again. The surrender felt like betrayal, not just of his country, but of his family's hope. The march to the temporary holding area was long and merciless. Sand gritted between Marco's teeth, each step grinding despair deeper into his body. Some prisoners muttered prayers, others cursed Mussolini under their breath, their loyalty breaking down as quickly as their strength. Carlo stumbled once, nearly collapsing. Marco caught his arm, pulling him upright. "Don't give them the satisfaction," Marco hissed. But even as he said it, he wondered if the Americans even wanted satisfaction, or if they simply wanted the war to end. When they reached the barbed wire enclosure, Marco expected cruelty. He expected beatings, snarled commands, the sting of humiliation. Instead, water was passed around, lukewarm, but water nonetheless. An American medic even checked the wound of an Italian who had collapsed, his bandages quick and efficient. The sight unsettled Marco more than any violence could. Was this kindness a trick? Was it meant to weaken their guard before something worse? That night, Marco lay on the ground staring at the endless desert sky, stars sharp as blades. The air cooled, but his fear burned hotter. Tomorrow they would be shipped somewhere unknown. The older men whispered that ships would carry them across the ocean, far from Europe, to lands where they would vanish from memory. Marco's heart pounded as he thought of the Atlantic, of being swallowed by waves, of being swallowed by history itself. Carlo leaned close, voice breaking. "Promise me, Marco, whatever happens, we'll survive it." Marco swallowed the lump in his throat. "We'll survive somehow." He wanted to believe it, yet fear gnawed at him, whispering of cages, hunger, and unending punishment. The word prisoner tasted like ash on his tongue. And still, beneath the terror, a sliver of curiosity lingered. What if the Americans were not as the stories claimed? What if survival did not mean misery, but something he could not yet imagine? That thought, fragile and dangerous, carried him into uneasy sleep. Before we continue with Marco's journey, remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters of this powerful story of survival, dignity, and transformation during World War II. The days that followed the surrender blurred into a haze of waiting, movement, and unease. Marco and hundreds of other Italian prisoners were gathered, counted, and herded onto transport trucks that rattled across the desert. Dust stung his eyes and clung to his throat, mixing with the bitter taste of defeat. Though the Americans kept order with firm commands, there was no cruelty. Still, The uncertainty of their fate gnawed at him with every passing mile. At a makeshift port, Marco first laid eyes on the ships. Massive grey hulls loomed over the prisoners like iron mountains, their decks lined with soldiers. The Atlantic, that distant and mysterious expanse he had only heard about in geography classes, now promised to swallow him whole. For many Italians, the sea was a friend. They were fishermen, sailors, sons of coastal towns. But this voyage was not of their choosing, and the ocean's vastness felt like exile itself. Carlo gripped Marco's arm as they shuffled toward the gangway. "They'll cram us in the holds like animals," he muttered, eyes darting nervously. "If the sea doesn't kill us, the hunger will." Marco said nothing. He had no comfort to offer. The rumors still thundered in his head. Starvation, chains, endless labor. He kept walking, boots striking the wooden planks with hollow echoes, until the ship swallowed him into its belly. The hold was crowded, rows of hammocks strung between steel beams, the air thick with sweat and the faint sting of oil. Men jostled for space, muttering curses in Neapolitan, Sicilian, Venetian dialects, voices clashing like restless waves. Marco slid into a hammock that swung unsteadily, the canvas pressing into his back. He tried to close his eyes, but the rocking of the ship already made his stomach twist. Hours turned into days, measured only by the clang of mess tins and the dim light that filtered through hatches. The food was strange, watery soup, bread that tasted of nothing, coffee darker and stronger than anything he had known. Some men spat it out in disgust, longing for the bitter but familiar espresso of home. Marco forced himself to drink, the bitter heat keeping his mind alert. Nights were the hardest. The ship groaned and shuddered, as waves slapped against its sides, each crash echoing like distant artillery. Marco lay awake, clutching the edge of his hammock, his body slick with sweat, despite the chill that seeped through the metal walls. Seasickness swept through the hold, men vomiting into buckets that overflowed too quickly. The stench was unbearable. Carlo moaned one night, his face pale and lips cracked. "I can't do this, Marco. I'd rather face bullets than this endless sea." Marco steadied him with a hand. "We'll endure. If we survive the desert, we'll survive this." Yet even as he said it, his own stomach lurched violently, and he knew he was one bad wave away from collapsing too. Not all was misery. There were moments when the prisoners, desperate to fight despair, sang old songs from the Italian countryside. The harmonies rose above the groans of the ship, weaving a fragile net of hope. Marco hummed along quietly, his voice low but steady, clinging to the melody like a lifeline. He began to notice something unexpected. The guards, though watchful, did not strike or shout. They spoke little Italian, but their tone was more weary than cruel. One night a young American soldier tossed an extra piece of bread toward the hold. It landed near Marco, who hesitated before breaking it in half and sharing it with Carlo. For the first time he wondered if the Americans were truly the monsters propaganda had painted. The voyage stretched endlessly, time measured not in days but in heartbeats and the rhythm of waves. Yet beneath the fear, Marco sensed change stirring. The ocean was carrying him farther than geography. It was carrying him toward a reckoning with everything he thought he knew. And as the ship cut westward across the dark Atlantic, a question rooted itself in his mind. If the journey was this strange, what would await them on the other side? After what felt like an eternity on the water, the prisoners were told they were nearing land. Marco pressed himself toward the small porthole near the deck, heart hammering with dread and anticipation. For weeks the horizon had been nothing but waves and sky, an endless void that stripped him of time. Now faint shapes rose from the mist, steel towers reaching for the heavens. "Is that it?" Carlo's voice cracked, his eyes wide. "America?" Marco nodded slowly. He had seen postcards of New York once, tucked into the hands of cousins who had emigrated years before. But no photograph had ever captured the sheer immensity of the skyline. The skyscrapers stood like giants, glittering in the morning light, bridges stretching across the water like steel ribbons. The harbor bustled with ferries, tugboats, and ships, larger than anything Marco had ever imagined. Around him men gasped, cursed, or fell silent. Naples, Rome, Florence. No city in Italy could compare to this sprawling colossus. It was overwhelming, intimidating, and strangely mesmerizing. "They say the Americans live like kings," muttered another prisoner, his voice low with both envy and suspicion. "But kings can be crueler than beggars." Marco swallowed hard, unable to shake the same thought. Surely such wealth had to be defended with brutality. If this was the land of their captors, what chance did men like him have to retain even a shred of dignity? On deck, American guards ordered them to line up. The commands were sharp, but the tone carried discipline rather than menace. Marco studied their faces. Young men not much older than himself, uniforms crisp, rifles held with precision. They looked strong, confident but not sadistic. He expected jeers or insults, yet there was only the businesslike efficiency of men carrying out a duty. The prisoners were marched off the ship and onto waiting trains. Marco's boots thudded on the platform, the cold bite of American air prickling his skin. He caught glimpses of dock workers pausing to stare, women carrying baskets of food, children pointing at the line of Italians shuffling past. None of them shouted curses or threw stones. Some looked curious, others indifferent, as though prisoners of war were simply another part of this massive country's routine. Carlo whispered urgently, "They watch us like we're animals in a zoo." Marco shook his head, though inside he felt the same. Every gaze seemed to strip him bare, reminding him of his weakness. Yet the absence of open hatred unsettled him most. Was this restraint a mask, hiding something darker to come? As the train pulled out of the city, Marco's eyes clung to the skyline fading into the distance. The grandeur of it stirred something unexpected in him, a mix of fear and reluctant admiration. How could such a place exist untouched by bombs and fire, while Italy crumbled under constant assault? Inside the carriage, the prisoners whispered in rapid bursts of dialect. Some speculated about forced labor, digging tunnels or building roads until their bodies gave out. Others insisted the Americans would send them to factories, feeding the war machine that crushed their homeland. Marco remained silent, staring out at the passing scenery. The city gave way to suburbs with neat rows of houses, then to wide stretches of farmland. Every field seemed endless, every barn sturdy and well kept. Carlo leaned closer, his tone hushed. "Look at it, Marco. They have so much." "Too much. Do you think they'll ever understand what it means to starve?" Marco didn't answer. He was too absorbed by the rolling landscapes, by the order and abundance that stretched beyond the horizon. Each mile pulled him deeper into mystery. Was this land of plenty a cage in disguise or something else entirely? Whatever awaited, he knew one truth. His life was about to change in ways he could not yet grasp. The train groaned as it pushed deeper into the American countryside, wheels clattering with a rhythm that seemed endless. Marco pressed his forehead against the glass, the cool surface grounding him, as the scenery unfolded like a story he had never read. Vast stretches of farmland rolled out in every direction, fields of corn swaying in the wind, cattle grazing lazily under an open sky. He had never seen so much land left untouched by war. No bomb craters, no burned houses, no rubble choking the streets. The sight was both comforting and disorienting. Carlo leaned closer, his breath fogging the window. "Look at those barns. They're bigger than the whole block where I grew up." Marco nodded, his thoughts heavy. "It's like another world." Inside the carriage, the Italian prisoners shifted restlessly. Some whispered about escape, though everyone knew it was impossible. Others stared silently at their boots as if refusing to acknowledge the strange abundance outside. The Americans guarding the car kept watch with quiet efficiency, rifles resting across their knees, but their eyes never wavered. Their discipline was unnerving, not the loud, brash dominance Marco had expected, but a steady calm that made resistance seem pointless. At one stop, the train idled long enough for Marco to catch a clearer glimpse of the locals. Farmers stood at a distance, straw hats shading their faces, while children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. They did not cheer the sight of prisoners, nor did they spit in contempt. They simply watched, cautious, but not hateful. Marco felt a flicker of relief, followed by confusion. If these were their enemies, why did their stares hold more curiosity than anger? Carlo muttered, "They don't know what to make of us. To them, we're probably just peasants from the other side of the world." Marco almost smiled. Well, that's not far from the truth. The farther they traveled, the more Marco noticed the rhythm of American life. Fields spread like green oceans, dotted with white houses and red silos. Horses pulled wagons down dirt paths, while shiny tractors roared across tilled soil. To Marco, whose country was strangled by shortages and rationing, the sheer normalcy of it felt unreal. He thought of his mother in Naples, struggling to find bread, and the contrast made his stomach twist. Hours bled into days, the prisoners growing restless. The food on the train was simple but steady. Bread, beans, sometimes meat that was tougher than leather, yet still more plentiful than what many of them had known back home. Marco chewed in silence, always alert for any sign that the Americans' apparent fairness was just a mask. One evening, as the train cut through rolling hills bathed in twilight, Marco finally broke his silence. "Carlo, what do you think is waiting for us? Labor camps, mines, worse?" Carlo shrugged, his voice bitter. "We're prisoners. Whatever it is, it won't be freedom." Yet even as he said it, Marco could see doubt in his friend's eyes. The Americans had shown no cruelty so far. Suspicion lingered, but so did an uncomfortable question. What if the enemy wasn't as merciless as they had been told? The train pressed on, deeper into the heartland. Marco's thoughts churned like the wheels beneath him, a restless mix of fear, wonder, and unease. Each mile carried him farther from Italy, farther from the ruins of Naples, and closer to a fate he could not yet name. When the guards finally announced that they were nearing their destination, a hush fell over the carriage. Marco gripped the edge of his seat, pulse quickening. Whatever awaited beyond those iron gates, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one he could neither predict nor escape. The train screeched to a halt under a relentless sun, the kind of heat Marco remembered only from the harshest Neapolitan summers. Dust rose as the prisoners were ordered to disembark, the air thick and dry in his lungs. He expected barbed wire curling like snakes, mud-soaked tents, and the stench of neglect. Instead, what he saw stopped him mid-step. Before him stretched rows of wooden barracks, neatly aligned, their roofs glinting in the light. Guard towers stood at the corners, watchful but not menacing, the rifles carried with discipline rather than malice. The wire fence was there, of course, a constant reminder of captivity. Yet the grounds inside were swept clean, paths marked with gravel, and even patches of grass peeking defiantly through the soil. It was organized, orderly, almost dignified. Carlo muttered, disbelief dripping from his words. "This can't be a prison. It looks better than the barracks we had in Italy." Marco said nothing, his eyes darting everywhere. He half expected hidden cruelty, some trap waiting for them once they stepped inside. The Americans barked instructions, brisk but not cruel, guiding the column of prisoners through the gates. Marco's heart pounded, his legs heavy as though the gravel beneath him were quicksand. Inside, the surprises continued. The barracks were wooden structures divided into long rooms filled with bunk beds, each bed with a thin mattress, a blanket, and even a pillow. Windows allowed streams of sunlight to cut through the shadows, and the faint smell of soap lingered in the air. Marco touched the frame of his bunk, waiting for splinters, but the wood was smooth. "This is a trick," whispered Carlo, shaking his head. "They want us calm before the real punishment begins." Marco wasn't so sure. He recalled the hunger in Naples, the families scraping together scraps to survive. Here the camp mess hall served food almost immediately. Bread still warm from the oven, beans simmered in a thick broth, slices of meat that glistened with juices. Marco hesitated, staring at the tray in his hands as though it might vanish if he blinked. The smell alone made his stomach cramp with longing. An older prisoner beside him laughed bitterly. "Eat, ragazzo, don't waste time doubting." Hunger is no illusion. Marco lifted the spoon and tasted the broth. It was simple but rich, filling. He ate slowly, every bite both comfort and torment, as guilt pressed against his chest. How could he, a prisoner, eat more in one meal than his mother and sister had in days back home? That night, as the camp settled into uneasy quiet, Marco lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. The sounds of men breathing around him, some snoring, some whispering prayers, filled the barracks with a rhythm that was oddly soothing. Yet his mind whirled. Was this comfort a facade? Would the guards turn cruel once the novelty wore off? Carlo rolled over from the bunk above, his voice hushed. If this is prison, maybe we should never leave. Marco's jaw tightened. Don't say that. Don't forget who we are, where we come from. But in the silence that followed, he knew he was lying to himself. The camp was not what he had feared. It was not paradise, not freedom, but it carried a strange, disarming humanity that unsettled him more than brutality ever could. Sleep came slowly. And as Marco drifted, one thought clung stubbornly in his mind. If the beginning felt like this, what awaited in the days to come? Morning arrived with a whistle that sliced through the air, sharp and merciless. Marco jolted awake, his blanket twisted around his legs. The barracks erupted in movement, boots hitting the floor, voices groggy but urgent, men stumbling into formation. American guards marched down the row, their commands brisk, their eyes watchful. Discipline was the law here, and Marco felt the weight of it press against his chest. They were lined up outside, the sun already climbing high, heat prickling at their necks. A tall American sergeant with square shoulders and a voice like gravel delivered instructions through a translator. Marco studied him carefully. This was Sergeant Miller, a man whose authority radiated without needing cruelty. His words were simple: respect the rules, obey orders, no violence, no escape. In return, they would be treated with fairness. Carlo leaned toward Marco, whispering, "Fairness? From soldiers? I'll believe it when I see it." Yet as the day unfolded, Marco saw signs that it was no empty promise. Roll call was strict but orderly. Meals were distributed on time, and the portions were enough to quiet the gnawing in his belly. A medical tent stood at the edge of camp, its white canvas gleaming, and prisoners with coughs or injuries were allowed inside. Marco watched in disbelief as an American doctor stitched a cut on a fellow prisoner's hand with practiced care, as though tending to an ally rather than an enemy. Still, suspicion lingered. Many of the Italians muttered under their breath, refusing to trust what they saw. Some clung stubbornly to pride, calling the camp a gilded cage, nothing more. Marco felt torn. He knew captivity was humiliation, yet the reality before him clashed violently with the dark stories whispered back in North Africa. That evening, Father Donati, the chaplain captured alongside them, gathered a group of prisoners beneath a patch of shade. His voice, warm and steady, carried a calm Marco had not felt in weeks. "Dignity can be found even here," the priest said. "Not because our captors grant it, but because we hold it within ourselves. Remember who you are, not just soldiers, but men, sons, brothers." Marco listened quietly, the words seeping into him like water into parched soil. For the first time, he felt the possibility that life here, though confined, might allow for something more than survival. Later, as night settled, Marco and Carlo sat on the steps of their barracks. The air was cooler now, stars flickering above the fence line. Carlo gnawed at a piece of bread, still skeptical. "You really think they mean to keep their word? That we're not just waiting for the hammer to fall?" Marco shrugged, staring at the sky. "I don't know, but today no one struck us. No one spat in our faces." "That's more than I expected." Carlo grunted, unconvinced, yet even he could not hide the relief in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly, no longer braced for constant blows. The camp had rules, yes, but those rules seemed built not to break men but to contain them. Marco turned the thought over in his mind, uneasy. Was it possible that the Americans truly intended to treat them with humanity? The question lingered like a riddle he could not solve. As he returned to his bunk, fatigue pulling him under, Marco knew only one thing with certainty. Tomorrow would bring new tests, and if the rules were real, he would have to decide whether to resist them or adapt and find a way to endure. The announcement came at dawn, delivered in clipped English through the translator. Prisoners would begin labor assignments outside the camp. A murmur spread among the Italians, suspicion mingled with dread. Marco's gut tightened. The stories from North Africa had warned of endless toil under a merciless sun, work meant to break their bodies and spirits. Carlo spat on the ground, bitterness in every gesture. "Here it is, Marco. Now we'll see the truth. They fattened us up for this." Marco said nothing, though unease coiled in his stomach. He expected chains, whips, perhaps guards barking insults as they drove men into fields like beasts. Instead, the prisoners were grouped calmly, handed tools, hoes, shovels, baskets, and loaded into trucks. The engines growled as they rolled through the countryside. Through the slats, Marco stared at the land unfurling before him. Acres of cotton stretched toward the horizon, their white blossoms glowing in the morning light. Farmers waved as the trucks passed, not with scorn, but with cautious acknowledgement. Marco could not understand it. Were they truly being sent to help cultivate, rather than suffer punishment? When they arrived, the farmers approached, men weathered by sun and years of labor. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, tipped his hat in greeting. Marco blinked in disbelief. This farmer did not sneer. Instead, he spoke slowly, almost politely, explaining tasks with gestures and the occasional word the Italians recognized. The work began. The soil was dry and stubborn, clinging to Marco's boots, his muscles burning as he bent and lifted. Sweat trickled down his spine, and yet it was no worse than the work he had done back home as a boy, helping neighbors tend small plots of land outside Naples. There was dignity in the rhythm of labor, even here in captivity. At midday, the prisoners were given water, cool and plentiful, and sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. Marco held the bread in his hands, staring at it with disbelief. Carlo gawked beside him. "They feed us while we work, like we're men, not animals." Marco took a bite, the bread soft, the filling salty and rich. He chewed slowly, almost ashamed of the pleasure. As the hours dragged on, fatigue set in, but not despair. The guards watched, but their eyes were steady rather than cruel. Farmers sometimes corrected the Italians with gestures, even smiles, showing them better ways to handle the tools. A strange thought crept into Marco's mind. Perhaps this work was not meant to humiliate, but to make use of idle hands. That evening, as the trucks rumbled back toward camp, Marco's body ached, but his spirit felt strangely light. The countryside bathed in golden light reminded him of summers in Italy, when vineyards stretched under the sun and life still felt simple. Carlo groaned, rubbing his back. "It's work, yes, but not chains, not whips. I don't know what to think anymore." Marco looked out at the passing fields, thoughtful. Maybe it's not what we feared. Carlo shook his head stubbornly. "Don't let them fool you. This is still prison." Yet deep down, Marco sensed something shifting. The Americans had given them labor, yes, but not as punishment, not as cruelty. It was work that carried a faint echo of freedom, a rhythm that reminded him of life before the war. As the camp gates came into view, Marco's thoughts churned. If even labor here defied his expectations, what other surprises lay ahead? Life in the camp began to take on a rhythm. Work in the fields, meals in the mess hall, evenings spent talking or resting. Yet the greatest surprises came not from labor or food, but from the small collisions of culture that happened every day. Marco felt them in every gesture, every word, every strange habit that reminded him how far he was from Naples. The first clash came in the mess hall. An American cook served the prisoners a steaming dish he called stew. Marco peered into the bowl, the mixture of meat and vegetables floating in thick broth. He tasted it cautiously, then winced. "This has no soul," he muttered. "No garlic, no herbs, nothing." Carlo laughed, slapping his back. "Careful, they'll call you ungrateful." An American guard overheard and smirked. "How you Italians think you're chefs, huh?" Marco tried to explain in broken English, gesturing with his hands. "Food must sing. This—" He waved at the bowl. "Silent." The guard chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe one day you'll cook for us, then we'll see." That night, several prisoners sat around a table, trading memories of pasta, bread baked in stone ovens, olive oil drizzled over everything. Their voices grew animated, hands painting pictures in the air. For Marco it was both comfort and torture. The Americans passing by stopped to listen. They didn't understand the words, but the passion was unmistakable. One even muttered, half in awe, They talk about food like it's poetry. Language, too, was a battlefield. The prisoners picked up fragments of English, stumbling through greetings and commands. Marco tried hard, repeating words under his breath until they felt less foreign. Still, misunderstandings were constant. One afternoon, a prisoner asked for soap, but pronounced it like soup. The guard, confused, brought him a steaming bowl of broth instead. Laughter erupted, the kind that eased tension rather than deepened it. "See," Carlo chuckled, clapping the man's shoulder, "we'll starve clean or wash full, but never both." The guards laughed too, and for a moment the wire fences felt less suffocating. Then came the encounter that stayed with Marco. While working on a nearby farm, he noticed a young woman watching from the porch. Her hair was tied back, her dress plain but neat, and curiosity shone in her eyes. When the prisoners paused for water, she stepped closer, carrying a basket of apples. The farmer shouted something sharp in English, warning her back, but she ignored him. She offered the basket to the men, smiling timidly. Marco hesitated before taking one, the cool skin firm in his hand. "Thank you," he said carefully, the words awkward but earnest. She nodded, her voice soft. "You're welcome." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it unsettled Marco deeply. She had looked at him not as an enemy, not as a criminal, but as a man. That night, lying in his bunk, he turned the apple over in his hand before biting into it. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, sharper than memory itself, and he realized how starved he was not just for food, but for kindness. Still, clashes remained. Some prisoners bristled at American habits, the way they drank coffee by the gallon, black and harsh instead of savoring a small cup, the way they chewed gum constantly, as if unable to rest their jaws. To the Italians it all seemed brash, excessive, almost childish, and yet beneath their mocking, curiosity grew. Marco found himself caught between ridicule and fascination. The Americans were different, yes, but they were not monsters, and the more he observed, the more he wondered how much of what he had believed about them had been a lie. Each day brought new surprises, small yet powerful. And with every clash, every laugh, every shared moment, the walls inside Marco's heart began to crack. The days stretched into weeks, and life inside the camp began to form a strange rhythm. Yet it was in the evenings, after labor was finished and meals eaten, that the true heart of the prisoners emerged. Marco noticed it first in the faint hum of a melody drifting through the barracks, an old Neapolitan song carried on a prisoner's weary voice. Soon others joined, voices weaving together into harmonies that rose and fell like waves against stone. Marco closed his eyes, the music tugging him homeward. He could almost see the narrow streets of Naples, lanterns glowing above the laundry lines, neighbors leaning from balconies to sing together after long days. Here, thousands of miles away, the songs stitched a fragile thread of belonging. Even some American guards lingered outside the barracks, listening quietly. Carlo grinned one night, nudging Marco. "Look at them. Even the Americans can't resist our music." An older prisoner, Pietro, lifted his hands like a conductor, his booming baritone leading the group into another song. Laughter followed wrong notes, and applause rippled at the end. Marco realized these moments were more than entertainment. They were survival. Music gave them dignity, a reminder that they were not just prisoners but men with a culture no barbed wire could erase. Food, too, became a bridge. One afternoon, the Americans supplied ingredients, flour, tomatoes, onions, and allowed the Italians to cook their own meal. The barracks filled with frantic energy, men arguing over recipes, each claiming his mother's way was the only right way. Marco kneaded dough beside Carlo, the motions instinctive, muscle memory from childhood afternoons in his mother's kitchen. The smell of bread baking drifted through the air, rich and comforting, drawing even guards closer with curious noses. When the meal was served, the Italians sat proudly, bowls steaming with a rustic pasta dish that was simple yet full of flavor. Marco watched as Sergeant Miller accepted a plate, hesitated, then took a bite. His eyebrows shot up. "Not bad," he admitted, almost grudgingly. The prisoners erupted in laughter, and for the first time, Marco saw Americans and Italians sitting side by side, sharing bread without suspicion. The sound of clinking spoons and bursts of laughter filled the hall, dissolving the invisible walls that had lingered between them. Carlo leaned close, whispering with a crooked smile, "We may have lost the war, Marco, but tonight we conquered their stomachs." The Americans in turn introduced the Italians to their food. Coffee that was black and bitter, hamburgers sizzling on iron grills, corn on the cob roasted until golden. The Italians mocked at first, too plain, too heavy, but Marco noticed how quickly the mocking gave way to curiosity, then to genuine enjoyment. The corn's sweetness surprised him. The burger's smoky richness clung to his tongue. One evening, a guard brought a harmonica, its sharp notes cutting through the air. At first, the Italians listened in silence, puzzled by the unfamiliar sound. Then Pietro clapped in rhythm, and soon voices rose again, blending Italian folk songs with the harmonica's wail. Cultures collided, clumsy yet joyful, creating something entirely new. Marco felt his chest tighten with a warmth he hadn't expected. Music, food, laughter. These things were stitching connections where only fences had stood. He thought of his mother again, how she had always said that sharing a meal could make strangers into family. Perhaps she had been right, yet the thought carried both comfort and unease. The more he tasted, the more he sang, the harder it became to see the Americans as enemies. And in the quiet moments after the laughter faded, Marco wondered, if kindness could be found here, what did that mean for the loyalties he still carried inside? The camp buzzed with unusual energy when the news spread. Mail had arrived from Italy. For weeks Marco had prayed for a letter, clutching memories of home like fragile glass. Now, as names were called out, he sat rigid, every muscle tense, fearing silence more than bad news. Bianchi, Marco. His breath caught. The guard handed him an envelope, its paper creased and stained, the ink smudged by time and distance. Marco held it as though it were sacred, afraid to open it too quickly, afraid it might dissolve in his hands. He sat on his bunk, heart hammering, and finally tore it open. The handwriting was his mother's, hurried but steady. She spoke of Naples, streets scarred by bombings, neighbors gone, ration lines stretching for hours. She reassured him that she and his sister were alive, though every sentence dripped with exhaustion. "We survive on little," she wrote, "but we survive." Marco's vision blurred. He read the letter again and again, each word etching itself into his chest. He could almost hear her voice, soft but firm, as if she stood beside him, yet guilt crept in, heavier than chains. He thought of the bread on his tray, the stew filling his belly, the laughter echoing in the mess hall. How could he live in such relative comfort while his family starved under bombardment? Carlo noticed his silence. "Bad news?" he asked softly. Marco shook his head, voice rough. "They're alive. But what does that matter if I sit here, eating while they starve?" Carlo frowned, chewing his lip. "It matters because they need you alive too. Don't dishonor their struggle by wasting yours." That night, Marco walked to the small chapel where Father Donati sat reading. The chaplain looked up, his eyes kind. "A letter, Marco?" Marco handed it to him. "They suffer while I am safe. I feel like a coward." Father Donati read quietly, then folded the paper with care. "You are not safe. You are a prisoner. But yes, you are fed, clothed, sheltered. Do not mistake survival for betrayal. Your mother's words carry hope, not condemnation. She wants you to endure so you can return." Marco lowered his head, shame and relief tangling within him. "I feel powerless." "You are," the priest admitted gently, "but powerless does not mean worthless. Sometimes living with dignity is all we can do." The next morning, Marco reread the letter until the paper softened under his fingers. He carried it with him through the fields, the ink etched deeper into his mind than the calluses on his hands. Each word was a reminder of who he was and why he must endure. During the midday break, Anna, the farmer's daughter who had once offered them apples, appeared again, this time with a jug of water. She caught Marco's distant expression. "Bad news?" she asked hesitantly, her English careful. Marco hesitated, then nodded. "Family in Naples. War is hard." Her eyes softened. "I'm sorry." She offered him the jug. But maybe hope travels in letters too. He accepted the water, throat tight, surprised by her empathy. A stranger, a daughter of the enemy, yet her kindness steadied him. That evening, as songs rose again in the barracks, Marco joined, his voice heavier, deeper. The melody carried sorrow but also determination. Carlo glanced at him, recognizing the change. The letter had carved wounds, yes, but also lit a flame. Marco clutched the paper once more before sleep, whispering into the dark, "I'll come back, I swear it." It began as a whisper in the barracks, carried from bunk to bunk like smoke slipping through cracks. Marco first heard it from Pietro, the older prisoner who always claimed to know more than most. "They say we may be sent home soon," he murmured one evening, eyes gleaming with cautious hope. "Italy has surrendered. The Americans will no longer keep us." The words struck Marco like a stone. Home. The thought was intoxicating, yet it twisted his stomach with unease. He imagined the ruined streets of Naples, his mother standing in breadlines, his sister's hollow eyes. Could he truly return to such devastation? Carlo scoffed. "You believe that? We are pawns. They'll move us where they want, when they want. Don't fool yourselves." Still, the rumor grew. Some prisoners whispered of ships being prepared. Others claimed Italian soldiers were already being repatriated. At work in the fields, the men spoke of nothing else. Marco felt the air buzzing with restless anticipation. Every conversation weighted with dreams and fears. One afternoon, during a break beneath the shade of an oak tree, Marco turned to Carlo. "If it's true, would you want to go back?" Carlo chewed at a blade of grass, his expression unreadable. "Of course, my family needs me, but—" He exhaled sharply. "I don't know what's left. My village might not even exist anymore. Sometimes I think I'd rather stay here than return to ashes." The honesty in his words startled Marco. He felt the same conflict gnawing at him, though he had not dared to voice it. America was captivity, yes, but it was also food, order, dignity. Italy was freedom wrapped in ruin. That night, Marco lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. Father Donati's words echoed in his memory. Dignity could be preserved even here, but could dignity survive back home, where survival itself was uncertain? He turned the question over like a stone in his palm, heavy and unyielding. The next day, while distributing supplies, Sergeant Miller addressed the prisoners directly. His Italian was broken but understandable. "There are talks," he said slowly. "Nothing decided yet. Some of you may go home. But not now. Not soon. War is not finished." The men erupted in murmurs, hope colliding with disappointment. Marco studied Miller's face, searching for hidden meaning, but the sergeant's eyes were steady, neither cruel nor sympathetic. Later, Marco spoke quietly to Anna, the farmer's daughter, when she passed by with a basket of eggs. "They say maybe we go home." Her brow furrowed. "That is good, isn't it?" Marco hesitated. "Yes, and no." She tilted her head. "Because home is broken?" He nodded, surprised by her insight. "Yes, broken." Anna placed the basket down and looked at him with quiet seriousness. "Sometimes broken things can grow again, but it takes time, and people strong enough to rebuild." Her words lingered with him, a strange comfort wrapped in simplicity. Back in the barracks, excitement clashed with dread. Some men packed their few belongings in anticipation, as if a ship might arrive tomorrow. Others scoffed, calling it false hope meant to keep them docile. Marco found himself caught between both camps, his heart torn. He wanted to return, yet he feared what awaited more than what he lived now. As the days passed and no news came, tension thickened. Every creak of the camp gates, every order shouted by guards, set the men whispering again. Marco watched their faces, the hunger for certainty burning in every eye. And he realized that the cruelest part of the rumor was not whether it was true or false, but the way it forced every man to confront what home meant after war. The barracks, once alive with songs and laughter, grew heavy with tension. The rumors of repatriation had divided the prisoners into factions, those who longed for home no matter the cost, and those who clung to pride, insisting that to accept American kindness was to betray Italy. Marco sensed the storm building, unease simmering in every glance, every hushed conversation. It broke one evening after supper. Two groups of men squared off in the yard, their words sharp as knives. Pietro, who had always led with his booming voice, declared loudly, "We are soldiers of Italy, to eat their food, to smile at their guards, to sing with them. It is shame." His face flushed with fury as he jabbed a finger at Marco and others like him. "You forget who you are." Carlo stepped forward, fists clenched. "And what would you have us do? Starve? Sit in silence until we rot? Pride doesn't fill the belly, Pietro. Pride doesn't keep men alive." The crowd rumbled with shouts, anger spilling over. Marco felt heat rise in his chest, his heart pounding. He had tried to stay silent, but the accusation cut too deep. He stepped between them, voice trembling but firm. "Enough! We are still Italians, yes, but we are men before soldiers. To sing, to eat, to live, it is not betrayal, it is survival." Pietro sneered. "You sound like them already. An American dog." The insult stung, but Marco stood his ground. Around him, faces turned, watching, waiting for him to falter. He drew a slow breath. "No. I am my mother's son, my sister's brother. I am Italian. But I will not spit on dignity when it is given. I will not live in hate when I can live in hope." The words hung in the air, heavy, unshakable. For a moment, silence swallowed the yard. Then, with a snarl, Pietro shoved past, muttering curses. Some followed him, their eyes still burning with loyalty, twisted into anger. Others stayed, their shoulders relaxing, their breath steadying. Carlo clapped Marco's back. "You said what needed to be said." But Marco felt no triumph, only exhaustion. His hands trembled as he sat on the steps of the barracks, the weight of his words pressing down. He had chosen a side, not of politics, not of armies, but of humanity. And in doing so he had drawn a line between himself and men who once were brothers in arms. Later in the quiet of the night, Father Donati approached. "You showed courage, Marco. Not the courage of battle, but of conscience." Marco shook his head. "I fear I have only made enemies." The chaplain's eyes were steady. "Perhaps. But you also showed others they do not have to drown in bitterness. That matters more than you know." Still, Marco could not shake the unease. He thought of Pietro's glare, of the whispers that would follow him now. The camp no longer felt as safe as before, yet deep within he knew he could not turn back. The test had come, and he had chosen to stand for something larger than pride. As he lay in his bunk, the air thick with unspoken tension, Marco closed his eyes. His chest ached, but his resolve was firm. The war might strip him of uniform, weapon, and freedom, but it would not take his humanity. And that realization, fragile yet unyielding, would guide him into whatever trials lay ahead. By 1944, the rhythm of camp life had become familiar, but beneath its surface change pulsed like an underground current. News of the war drifted in through guards' conversations, newspapers passed from hand to hand, and letters that trickled into the barracks. Germany was faltering. Rome had been liberated. Italy itself was no longer an enemy, but an occupied, fractured land. Marco read a scrap of newspaper one guard left behind, its English words haltingly translated by Pietro. "Allies advance in France. Germany retreating." The barracks buzzed with speculation. For the first time since capture, the end of the war felt like more than a distant dream. Carlo exhaled, his voice low. "If it ends, what happens to us? Are we still prisoners or are we allies?" Marco had no answer. His heart tightened with conflicting emotions. The war that had stolen his youth was collapsing, yet its end promised no certainty. Was he to return to Naples, to ruins and hunger? Or would he remain here, in the strange paradox of captivity filled with dignity? The Americans, too, seemed restless. Guards spoke of brothers fighting in Europe, of hope for the war to finish quickly. Sergeant Miller was stricter than usual, his orders crisp, his face set in lines of fatigue, but Marco noticed his glances, softer now, less wary. Perhaps Miller, too, knew that the prisoners were no longer enemies in the old sense. One evening, during roll call, Miller addressed them directly, his voice gruff but steady. "Italy, no longer with Germany. For you, the war is different now. But you are still prisoners until war is over." The words rippled through the men, stirring hope and frustration in equal measure. Some cheered quietly, imagining release. Others scowled, unwilling to trust. Marco stood in silence, the truth sinking deep. They were no longer enemies, yet not free. Suspended in limbo, they belonged nowhere. That night, Marco sat outside the barracks. The summer air warm, cicadas singing beyond the fences. Carlo joined him, restless energy in his stride. "Do you think they'll send us home soon?" Marco shook his head slowly. "Soon means nothing in war. We may wait months, years even." Carlo clenched his fists. Then what was all this for? To be neither enemy nor ally, just forgotten men? Marco gazed at the stars, his chest heavy. Maybe not forgotten, maybe waiting for the world to remember us. Inside, the mood of the prisoners shifted daily. Laughter one moment, bitterness the next. Some men grew bold, speaking openly with guards, practicing English, even helping farmers with more enthusiasm. Others retreated into silence, clinging to loyalty to Mussolini, or simply to the idea that suffering proved honor. Marco walked between these worlds, caught between hope and guilt. He longed for his mother's voice, his sister's smile, but he also feared returning to rubble. In the camp he felt the strange contradiction of being trapped yet alive, caged yet human. Father Donati spoke quietly one evening, his words meant for anyone who would listen. "The war will end, yes, but what will we carry from here into peace? Hatred or something else? That choice will decide more than any treaty." Marco felt those words carve into him. He knew the end was coming. News, letters, even the guards' weary faces told him so. But the end of war did not mean the end of struggle. A harder journey lay ahead, one that no fence or guard tower could contain. As he returned to his bunk, Marco whispered into the dark, not sure if it was a prayer or a vow. "When this ends, I must choose who I will be." The announcement came at sunrise. Preparations were being made for departure. The war in Europe was reaching its close, and the Italians would soon be sent back across the ocean. The camp, usually steady in its rhythm, shifted into a restless tide of packing, whispers, and long looks at the fences that had both confined and protected them. Marco felt the news sink slowly into his chest, heavy yet hollow. For months, he had imagined freedom as a distant dream. Now it stood before him, and instead of joy, he felt an ache he could not name. Carlo, stuffing his few belongings into a worn sack, tried to sound triumphant. "Finally, Marco. We're going home." Marco nodded, but his eyes lingered on the barracks, the fields beyond the wire, the guard towers etched against the sky. Yes, home. The word tasted strange. In the days before departure, the camp arranged a farewell gathering. Farmers who had worked with the Italians came, their families trailing behind, curiosity and respect in their faces. The air smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread. A long table was set with food, some American, some prepared by the prisoners themselves. For a few hours the lines blurred, captors and captives sharing laughter and bread. Anna approached Marco with her usual timid smile. She held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said softly. Inside was a handkerchief, embroidered with simple blue flowers. "So you remember." Marco's throat tightened. "I will not forget," he managed, his voice rough. He wanted to say more, to explain the gratitude that words could not carry, but all he could do was hold the cloth like it was more valuable than gold. Sergeant Miller, too, approached the group of Italians. His voice was gruff, his manner unchanged, yet there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You did your duty here, you worked hard." "Go back with honor," Carlo muttered under his breath. "Honor in defeat." But Marco caught the weight of Miller's words. They were not about armies or battles. They were about endurance, about dignity, kept even in captivity. That evening the Italians sang one last time, their voices strong, carrying across the camp. The Americans listened in silence, some visibly moved. Marco sang louder than he ever had, each note a farewell stitched with sorrow and pride. When the final chord faded, the camp was still, the night heavy with unspoken understanding. On the morning of departure, the prisoners were lined up. The trucks waited, engines rumbling. Marco looked back at the camp one last time. He remembered the fear of his arrival, the disbelief at the food, the laughter over misused English words, the music that had bound them together. He remembered kindness where he had expected cruelty. Carlo nudged him. "Are you ready?" Marco swallowed hard. "As ready as I can be." As the trucks rolled away, Marco felt a strange tug in his chest, as though he were leaving behind not just a camp, but a chapter of himself. He pressed the embroidered handkerchief in his pocket, its fabric soft against his palm, a reminder that even in captivity he had found fragments of humanity. The road ahead led to ships, to the vast Atlantic once more, to Italy's broken shores. And though fear stirred within him, Marco carried something he had not possessed when he first stepped into the camp, the certainty that kindness could exist even in the darkest of times. The journey across the Atlantic was calmer this time, but for Marco it carried a weight heavier than the restless seas. He stood at the rail, the embroidered handkerchief Anna had given him folded safely in his pocket, the salt air filling his lungs. Around him, prisoners spoke in hurried tones, imagining reunions, fearing devastation, clinging to hope. Carlo leaned on the rail beside him, eyes narrowed at the horizon. "Strange, isn't it? We dreamed of this, and now I almost wish we were staying." Marco nodded, the thought unspoken but familiar, because here we knew what to expect. Out there, we don't. When the ship finally reached Naples, the men crowded the deck. Marco's breath caught. His beloved city, once alive with color and music, now lay scarred. Buildings gaped open like broken teeth, smoke curled from collapsed streets, and rubble replaced familiar plazas. The air smelled of ash, salt, and sorrow. Stepping onto the pier, Marco felt both joy and grief claw at his chest. He was home, but it was not the home he remembered. Women with weary faces searched the crowds. Children clung to their skirts, voices calling out names lost in the sea of uniforms. Marco's heart pounded as he scanned the chaos. Then he saw her, his mother, thinner than before, her hair streaked with grey, but her eyes still fierce with love. She pushed through the crowd, calling his name. "Marco!" He stumbled forward, his throat tight, and embraced her. She trembled against him, and for the first time since capture, Marco allowed himself to cry openly. His sister appeared beside her, eyes wide, cheeks hollow, but smiling through tears. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised I would," Marco said, his voice breaking. That night, reunited in their small damaged apartment, Marco listened as his mother described the hardships, the hunger, the bombings, the nights spent hiding underground. He shared his own story cautiously, telling of the camp, the work, the strange kindness of Americans. At first she frowned, unable to reconcile the image of enemies with compassion. But as Marco spoke, she touched his arm and whispered, "If they gave you life, then perhaps they were not all enemies." Marco lay awake later, staring at the cracked ceiling. He thought of the camp, of music that had carried him through despair, of bread broken with strangers, of lessons learned not through battle but through shared humanity. He realized then that paradise had never meant luxury or freedom. It meant dignity, respect, and the chance to remain human even in captivity. In the days that followed, Marco joined others in clearing rubble, carrying bricks, helping rebuild walls. Every stone lifted was a reminder of both loss and resilience. He felt the weight of his past, but also the strength of what he had endured. Carlo visited him often, their friendship surviving the return. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Carlo said, "Strange, isn't it? We feared the worst from them, and yet sometimes I think we learned more about life from those months in America than from all our years before." Marco smiled faintly, sweat on his brow. We learned that enemies can still be men, and men can still be kind. As the sun set over the battered city, Marco tucked the embroidered handkerchief into his pocket once more. He carried no illusions. Italy was broken, the road ahead uncertain, but he also carried the memory of compassion found in unexpected places, a memory that would guide him through the long rebuilding. And in that truth, he found his own quiet victory. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of survival and transformation. And if you want to keep this journey alive, click on the video waiting for you on the screen. Your next story begins there.